All right, so we've got these maps and analysis you send over about global fertility rates.
Yeah.
And they're covering like a huge period from 1950 all the way to 2023.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
It is, right?
Yeah.
It's like looking at a time machine for demographics.
You could say that again.
We're talking about those huge families, 6 or more kids being the norm in tons of places.
That's right. Yep.
And then suddenly, like, countries are struggling with having too few babies.
It's a complete 180.
Totally. So what really stands out to you in all this? Like, what surprised you the most looking at all these trends?
Well, it's kind of obvious, right? Like, everyone knows global fertility is declining.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating is how different it is depending on where you look.
Yeah, the maps are pretty wild.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
In the data skies, we take our flight. Trends and numbers come to life. Colors and charts, they dance and play. Showing truth in a visual way. In GenderDecoded, we uncover truths and stories like no other. In the data waves we find the secret maps of humankind.
Okay, so you guys wanted a deep dive into global fertility rates. And we're looking at changes from 1950 to 2023.
Okay.
And let me tell you, these maps are crazy.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah.
It's wild. It's like watching the world change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right in front of us. I mean, some regions have gone from like 6+ kids per family to like 2 on average.
Wow.
Like a single lifetime.
It is really one of the most impactful changes, I think, of the last century.
Really?
And we are just starting to kind of grapple with what it all means, you know, because we're talking economies, we're talking how societies function,
Right.
even how, you know, resources and the environment are going to be strained by all of this.
Okay, so let's break it down.
Sure.
First, the big picture. What's the overall trend that we see in fertility rates across the globe?
Like, nutshell version.
Yeah.
A pretty dramatic global decline. And, you know, for most of human history, fertility rates were much higher, like much higher. What we're seeing now is unique because of how quickly and widely it's happening.
I'm looking at these maps, and the thing that pops out to me the most is Asia.
Yeah.
Like, it's insane. Just like the biggest change.
The sheer speed of change in Asia, especially East Asia, is kind of mind-boggling. And countries like China now have some of the lowest fertility rates in the world. And to give you like a really tangible example of how that happened, in China, when girls' school attendance rose by just 10%, their fertility rate dropped by a full child per woman within a decade. So that's like
that's great.
A really tangible example of how these things are so interconnected.
Wow, that is a powerful example.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes you realize, like you were saying, how interconnected it all is. But Asia's a huge region.
Right.
What about the rest of it? I mean...
You're right. It's not all the same story. So South Asia, including India, also saw big decreases, but not as extreme as East Asia.
Okay.
It really highlights that cultural and social factors play a huge role in decisions around family size.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's move on to Africa.
Okay.
They're starting from a point of higher fertility rates, right?
Exactly. So they still have the highest fertility rates globally.
Okay.
But they've also seen, you know, pretty significant decreases since the 1950s. I think it's important to remember with Africa that it's a very diverse continent.
Okay.
So Central and Western Africa have kind of maintained higher rates compared to other regions, likely because of like a slower pace of economic development there and more limited access to education and healthcare.
That makes sense. So Europe, they've been dealing with low fertility for a while now, right?
Yeah, that's true. They were already on that downward trend by 1950.
Wow.
And many European countries are now below what we call replacement level.
Replacement level, what does that mean?
So replacement level fertility is the average number of children each woman would need to have for a population to replace itself from one generation to the next without relying on immigration.
Gotcha.
It's usually around 2.1 children per woman, taking into account things like infant mortality and things like that.
Yeah.
And so when a country consistently falls below this level, its population will start to decline.
Okay, that makes sense. we've got this spectrum of fertility rates.
We do.
Going on around the world.
Huh?
So what about the Americas? Where do they fall?
So North America has actually stayed pretty stable with moderate fertility rates,
right,
while South America has seen a significant drop since the 1950s, though not as dramatic as East Asia.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting to see those regional differences play out.
Yeah. If we zoom out and we look at this whole picture, is there a common thread connecting these trends?
Yeah.
Especially the decline in fertility rates.
Yeah, there's a really strong connection between economic development and declining fertility.
Okay.
So as countries develop economically, we typically see, things like increased access to education, especially for women, and that is a game changer.
I've always been so fascinated by that connection between women's education and family size.
Yeah.
I remember reading about this program in India where they gave girls bicycles.
Wow.
So that they could more easily get to school, and it had a massive impact on fertility rates.
Wow.
In those communities. It's just wild how a simple thing like access to education can have such a huge impact.
Absolutely. And, when women have more opportunities, including, education careers, they tend to delay having children, and they have smaller families overall.
That makes sense.
It also ties into, increased access to healthcare and family planning, which gives people more control over their reproductive choices.
Okay, so we've seen these shifts in fertility rates. What does it actually mean for different parts of the world? Like, what challenges are we looking at?
Yeah, so in developed nations where fertility rates have been low for a while, we're seeing aging populations. Okay. And this creates what we call a higher dependency ratio.
Dependency ratio?
Oh, so it basically means that there are fewer working-age people to support a growing number of retirees.
Oh.
So you can imagine a society where there are far fewer working-age people to support the growing number of retirees.
Right.
This puts a strain on everything from healthcare systems to pension funds.
Yeah, that sounds pretty worrying. Is there anything that can be done to address that?
So some countries are experimenting with policies to try and encourage people to have more children. Okay. Things like financial incentives or subsidized childcare.
Okay.
But it's really complex.
Yeah.
There are no easy solutions. And there's a lot of debate about how effective these policies really are.
Okay, so what about regions with high fertility rates?
Yeah.
Like parts of Africa. What kind of challenges do they face?
It's kind of a double-edged sword.
Okay.
On the one hand, a young and growing population can be a tremendous asset for economic growth. Okay. Provides a really vibrant workforce.
Yeah.
But rapid population growth can also put a strain on resources and infrastructure.
Right. Especially if those systems aren't developed enough to keep pace.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about like the economics, the demographics of it all. Yeah. But what about the social side of this?
Right.
How do these trends affect things like gender roles and equality?
That's a really important part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Declining fertility often goes hand in hand with increased gender equity.
Okay.
So, women have more control over their bodies and their lives. They're more likely to pursue education and participate in the workforce.
Yeah.
We see this especially in places like Europe, North America, and East Asia, where fertility rates have been declining for longer.
That's good. I mean,
it's a positive outcome.
Yeah, but are there downsides to that too?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
When fertility rates drop really low, it can actually put more pressure on women in aging societies. If there aren't enough young people to care for the elderly, that responsibility often falls disproportionately on women.
Which can limit their career options and even lead to financial hardship.
So even something that seems positive on the surface, like declining fertility, can have unintended consequences for gender equality if we're not careful.
If we don't address the underlying social structures.
Right. So what about the challenges that women are facing in regions with high fertility rates?
Yeah. So in those contexts, we often see things like limited access to education, reproductive health care, and even basic contraception. And these factors really restrict women's choices and can perpetuate cycles of poverty and inequality. So empowering women through education, ensuring they have access to quality healthcare and reproductive services, and challenging those traditional gender norms is really essential.
Wow, this has been
a lot.
An incredibly insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
We covered a lot. We talked about the global decline.
We did.
In fertility rates.
Yeah.
How it varies across different regions. The link between development and family size and the challenges that come with both high and low fertility.
Right. And it leaves us with some big questions.
Yeah.
Given these trends, what do you think the future holds for global population growth?
Yeah.
And how will this shape societies and economies in the coming decades?
That's definitely something to think about.
Lots to ponder.
Yeah. And, it's a conversation I think we'll be having for a while.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As the world continues to change.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into fertility rates.
Thanks for having me.